Hello and welcome to Off the Track. Today we are going to be discussing car rendering, and joining me, Peter Russell, is Ben Galvin,
Howdy.
James Gurney,
Hey.
Jesse Stevens,
Yo, yo, yo.
and Michael Walker.
Hello.
So, yes, we're discussing car rendering, which are absolutely crucial for showcasing your car. In the World Final regulations, renderings are defined as images intended to illustrate the three-dimensional form of an object. They can be generated in isometric projection, oblique projection, or perspective. At the World Finals, teams must submit a set of engineering drawings including orthographic and 3D renders for scrutineering judging. Renders may also be used in the portfolio, pit display, social media, and verbal presentation, and at the World Finals, rendering accounts for 20 points. The highest criterion for rendering is described as different views, perfect match to final car, including branding, environment and lighting, and high-end render technique. Now, I'm no car rendering expert, but I'm joined with some of the world's best graphic designers and renderers. So I'm going to be throwing out a few questions. So, what software can you use for rendering?
Well, I guess there's a lot of different software. Our team, so for Horizon and for Aurora, we use Cinema 4D primarily, and just Cinema 4D, so you can directly import your car from whatever CAD software you're using, and then you sort of texture it, set up the lighting or whatever. What did you guys use?
Is Cinema 4D hard to learn, or did you learn it pretty quick?
It really varies. I mean, I learned from Michael. He sort of showed me how to use it, and then just tutorials online. So, I mean, it's sort of very similar controls to a CAD program. So,
Okay.
and yeah, you can sort of just follow tutorials online. They're quite readily available.
Yeah, and so Cinema 4D isn't that hard to learn. There's a wealth of tutorials online. If you do use it, Grayscale Gorilla, link in the description, is a good place to learn some things about Cinema 4D. You can also do rendering inside, I believe, Fusion 360.
Most CAD packages have some form of rendering software, which are usually good for maybe showcasing an idea without necessarily showing it to anyone important. So say if you just want to send a render of an idea to someone that, say, like a collaborator or a teammate, you just want to quickly get an idea across to them in a rendered fashion, that's what they're used for. But I wouldn't use, especially the one in Katia, I wouldn't use that for professional rendering, even if you could get logos on the stuff and everything.
Yeah. And Ben, you're using Keyshot, and that
Yeah.
seems pretty popular with the rest of Team Australia.
Yeah, so going into World Finals in 2019, I believe every single team from Team Australia actually has a sponsorship deal with Keyshot. Keyshot's actually fairly simple to use as well. Before going into Keyshot, I had essentially no CAD modeling knowledge whatsoever. But utilizing Keyshot, I was pretty easy to figure out. It's got a pretty simple workspace, as well as native animation support.
Something that Cinema 4D also has. And then there's also the free option without sponsorship, obviously of there's Maya, which you can get through Autodesk, and there's also Blender, which can be a bit finicky and needs some, if you're doing it situation renders, needs some modifications to make it look right, your renders. And I'll put a link to a video explaining that in the description. But that's a free alternative for those who can't get sponsorships.
Yeah, Blender's an open source one that's got a lot of capabilities.
And I assume with Cinema 4D and Keyshot, you can get education licensing?
Yep.
I'm not so sure about Cinema 4D, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, with Keyshot, there is a education discount you can get as well if you don't have a partnership with them.
One of the most important things, though, is make sure you have bought software. Do not try and crack licenses for this kind of stuff. Or if you just in general use the software unlicensed, you're going to have major troubles down the line.
Plus, it's legal.
Yeah. That's a good thing to point out.
Moral compass line as well.
Yeah. So with rendering, I assume it's a pretty resource-intensive task for computers. Does a computer need to be sort of pretty high-end? Can you do it on a laptop, or do you need like a proper sort of gaming high-end spec PC?
For general, like putting together your renders and that kind of stuff, you can do it on laptops. I used to do it when I was doing the renders through Infinitude and Precision. I used to do it on my laptop. You can render on laptops, but if you're doing any type of animations and videos, you want something, that's at least 4 cores, like 4 physical cores, preferably hyper-threaded, so you get 8 threads out of it. Because at least with Blender and Cinema 4D, they're CPU intensive. They don't utilize the GPU for acceleration or anything like that. So
Yeah.
if you're doing video, you want to have something pretty high end, 6700K or higher, I'd say, to get it out fast. Otherwise, you're going to really need to plan your time and have a good idea of how long it'll take to render things out, because it does take quite a while, especially with global illumination type tasks. James, Ben, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah. So sort of as Michael was saying, it depends on what sort of lighting and other filters and stuff you've got going on in your scene can make it take longer. And as Michael said, generally more threads is more performance as far as rendering and the speed. And yeah, when you're doing videos, I don't know about other software, but I know for Cinema 4D, for Aurora and Horizon, we utilize team rendering. So with the computers in our F1 room at school, overnight you had all the Cinema 4D team render clients on them, and you could link them up to the main one. So each computer would do a frame each. So like you would effectively be going at 30 times the rendering speed that you would be on one computer. So if you can imagine, if you're trying to do a video at, say, 60 frames per second, and you're trying to do a 1-minute video, you've got a lot of different frames to render, where on one computer you could be taking 2 minutes per frame. So by being able to distribute that over a large number of computers, you can, like, it's actually more practical, even possible to do really nice videos.
Ben, can you do that with Keyshot?
I don't believe there's that in Keyshot. However, with Keyshot 9, which was recently released, I believe about a week ago or less, they have included GPU acceleration, which is nice to see in a rendering program. So Keyshot can be a little GPU dependent, however, it is still very heavy CPU dependent. I mean, like Michael and James said, if you just want a simple render, you can do it on a laptop. However, video will take some time.
Yeah, and as Ben was saying, the whole GPU acceleration thing, you can do that in most programs, but it depends on the actual renderer that you use. So for Cinema 4D, you can download and use other renderers, but they fundamentally change how the lighting is calculated, and you have to use different lights and stuff like that. But you can get different ones. I can't remember the names of any off the top of my head, but a lot of them are quite expensive. But those are the sort of ones that are developed in-house by bigger companies that utilize GPU acceleration and stuff like that. But just the Cinema 4D standard one doesn't.
I'll put some links to some Cinema 4D renderers in the description. Yeah, and Keyshot does have network rendering capabilities. I just checked
It
that.
does?
Yes.
Nice.
Just to note, if you're going to do this, talk to your IT people at your school. Don't just try and install the network renderer on all the computers. Okay. Talk to your IT people about it, and possibly like your STEM coordinator or something like that if you feel you need them. And it does increase the speed of rendering a lot if you can get that working.
Yeah, and depending on if the ports are blocked locally, it might not even be possible.
Yeah.
All right. So obviously, rendering and CAD software, they're usually going to be a different package unless you're using something like Fusion. So how do you get your car from your CAD package into the renderer? What's the process of exporting your car?
So usually for Cinema 4D, you pass to your design engineer for a WRL file. STLs are fine for the most part, if they're high resolution, but they can make texturing difficult, and they're just not as good quality as WRL. I believe step and object files are also ones you can use for Cinema 4D. But if you get WRL, it's really nice to work with, and it's really easy to texture in Cinema 4D. Ben, what do you use for Keyshot?
So I mostly just work off step files because that's one of the easiest things to output from a Fusion file, WinMol in Fusion, and I just take the step file and import it into Keyshot. However, it can be difficult in Keyshot when it comes to material mapping and texture mapping due to the way Keyshot's labels work. However, there is a massive list of what Keyshot can do, including, ironically, Cinema 4D files.
Yeah, I mean, interplay between the two, I'm pretty sure Cinema 4D loads up Keyshot files as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, loading up different graphics packages software, there's a long list for Cinema 4D of file types it can ingest as well, and export to, interestingly enough.
But generally, most CAD packages and most rendering software will take an acceptable format from whatever you're using. So it shouldn't be too much of an issue of compatibility.
When you export from a CAD package, you generally can export in two different sort of file types. You have a mesh, which is like what's an object file or an STLR, and you have like sort of a brep, which is the sort of idea behind it, which is what step in that are. So like a step is a solid model, which has a solid internal, where a mesh is just a polygon mesh that goes around the whole outside of it. So for example, in CATIA, you can export as a WRL like Michael mentioned. And that's really handy in Cinema 4D. So when we designed the cars for us, we have different bodies that separate all the different components, like the tether guides, the front wings, the wheels. And when you export that as a WRL, that saves those individual what do you call it, divisions between all the parts of the car. So when you put that into Cinema 4D, you can already manipulate all those parts. Whereas depending on what other sort of types of files you put in, if you had an STL file, and depending on how you export that from your CAD package, that could just be one big mesh across your entire car, which doesn't let you manipulate independent parts of it, because it would just be one big mesh and you could only select polygons. So yeah, it's sort of, you just have to have a look, and it depends what you can even export. I don't know if Fusion exports WRLs, so there's probably similar alternatives like step files and stuff like that that'll work just as well with your...
Fusion is very picky about what it will export, and I found that I think step and object files, I've had the best luck getting into Cinema from Fusion.
Okay. So obviously, you want to put your final render up on your pit display, and obviously the pit display is a very large area. So what file formats are available for exporting your renders at, and what resolution would you recommend exporting your renders at? Obviously, there's file types, there's lossy and lossless file types. So how do those all sort of play into your, what do you consider when you export for different file types?
Well, I mean, for general purposes, like a PNG will be fine, really. When you sort of want to work out the resolution to export at, it really depends on what purpose you're going to be using it for. For any screens, like exporting it like the standard 1440p or something like that, which is 2560 by 1440 pixels, I think. It would be fine, but like, if you're wanting to put this on the back of your pit display, you can work out the dimensions of that poster, and then you can work out what like sort of PPI, pixels per inch, that would be, and then you generally, like, a high quality image would be at like 300 PPI. So like in your renderer, depending on, like in Cinema 4D for example, you can set the dimensions of your rendered area to be in millimeters, and then you can set what the PPI will be that you want it to be, and then that will give you the resolution that it needs to render at to be 300 pixels per inch when it's blown up to that sort of size.
And between the different file formats, TIFF is really good for print media if you want like uncompressed, just raw images. PNG has some compression, but it's lossless. So the difference between lossless and lossy compression is that lossless, you'll lose you won't lose any detail. It will compress but preserve as much detail as it can, and not like JPEG, which will just strip out parts of the file if it doesn't fit very well. Like detail is something JPEGs don't do very well with, and so they'll chop out parts of images to make them more compressed, and you'll start seeing blocks and that kind of thing. If you look at overly compressed JPEGs, you'll see that kind of effect. And so JPEGs really should only be used in web applications, and I'd stray away for them for any print applications in F1 in schools.
Yeah. My general kind of rule of thumb is, in terms of rendering and rendering file types, is depending on how large the render is, I mostly render between 8 to 4K, and that would be for, well, a large render on the booth display would be around 8K, whilst a smaller render that may be in the rendering book would only be 4K. I don't usually do anything lower than that unless I'm sending it over email and just wanting a quick render to pump out to send to someone. And if I'm sending something to my team, I'd usually render in JPEG simply because it renders faster due to compression speed.
Yeah, with cinema, just keep in mind that your render times aren't dependent on the file format. It renders and then you save it as whatever file type you use. So if you render it once, you can save multiple different types. So I usually save to TIFF, PNG, and JPEG. Just so I have all my bases covered in that kind of area.
Awesome. Do you guys have any tips for rendering? How to get like really good crisp renders?
I think one of the biggest things is probably you should make sure you pay a good attention to what you're going to be able to get on your car and matching that in your renders, or the other way around. So it could be a good idea, like depending on how your timeline works within your team. If you're trying to make your renders before the car, for example, sometimes if you have to get a paint color for your car that you want to try and closely match to your render, sometimes it's also good to then work backwards. If you get that paint color, try and match the render back to that paint color. Just keep it more consistent, because that's what the judges are looking for at the World Finals. And yeah, just make sure everything's accurate on your car compared to how you're going to have it in the real thing. Try and keep the reflections realistic, given the shine of your car and how glossy it is. And yeah, I guess just if you're doing animations and stuff like Cinema 4D offers the ability to autosave. So in your rendering settings, your output settings, you can automatically save things to a file. Otherwise, you'd have to export every frame individually. So you can just set it up with a naming system, so it'll just go up like 1, 2, 3, 4 sort of thing.
And so there's a couple of different render types you need to consider when you're doing your renders as well. Is whether it's just going to be a plain vanilla white background render, or whether it's going to be in situation. Now, I believe at the World Competition, it's a requirement that you produce in situation renders, and a render booklet these days, isn't it, Ben?
Yep.
Yeah, and so you need to give thought with your environment to pay attention to your lighting, because a lot of in Cinema 4D and in Blender, you can get physical skies, is what they're called in Cinema 4D, and they will do all of your light calculations for you and provide you with mostly accurate daytime lighting or evening lighting. And so you want to base your in situation renders around something like that to get you some nice realistic looking lighting. And if you're going to build your own environment, just make sure that you pay attention to little details. And if you want to see what like some good in situation renders look like, look at the Aurora renders or the Infinitude renders.
Probably more the Horizon ones, not the Aurora.
Oh, the Horizon ones? Yeah, okay. Or the Horizon ones, yeah, because the Horizon ones were really good ones as well. So yeah, we'll have some links in the description to some renders we're talking about. Also, with your orthogonal drawings, on some orthogonal drawings, I know we did this for Precision, and I believe we did it for Infinitude as well. We had a render in the orthogonal drawings that matched up with the isometric view, and so
Yes.
you can do that in Cinema by selecting you're usually in perspective mode, but you want to go to parallel.
In your camera settings.
Yeah, in your camera settings, you'll need to select parallel, and that will take you to a isometric view, which is doesn't have the parallax that you get with a perspective, where things that are further away are smaller. It's all equal in proportions, and so that's what isometric drawings are based on. And then your engineer can take that into whatever CAD package they're using, and they can put that image in the orthogonals with the overlay, and it just makes it look more complete.
It's not just that; it's also very useful for detailing a sticker map for your car, so where everything goes. Because a lot of people don't actually know where the stickers go on the car. So when you're stickering your car, you've just got a guide to look straight at.
Yeah,
and that's another render you can do, is different like side renders, side profile renders, just for your teammates, so that they know where the stickers are going when they put it together, if you're not the one putting the car together.
one of the things I would strongly recommend, was not something we tried for Horizon for the World Finals. In Cinema 4D, in your render options, there's like different. They're almost like filters, but it changes the way that the final look is. We use what's called Cell Renderer, so it basically makes it look like it's a drawing, like an orthographic drawing. So for one of the pages of our orthographic drawings, we had like side, top, back, front projections that had the orthographic, the cell rendered picture over it. So it sort of looks like it's in that same style as what the orthogonal drawings are. And then we even did a isometric cell render from the corner. So I think it might be a bit easier to do when you're doing direct renders from Fusion. I think I've seen teams do this before, but it seems like a very standard thing on a lot of actual engineering drawings, is having these orthogonal drawings with the realistic sort of look of the car rendered on. I'm sure we could probably list a example picture from the Horizon orthographic drawings that show the sort of render I'm talking about. But yeah, just adding sort of little bits of detail like that can really go a little bit further in the judging.
You do have to remember the main objective of the orthographic drawings is to ensure that you can reproduce the car or detail every process of manufacturing. So that is one of the most important things. It's not that is one of the most important things. So don't just put redundant renders in the orthographic book, but at the same time, it would be a good thing to do, but don't focus too much attention on it. You'll get almost full marks, if not full marks, for your renders if you don't have it.
Another really good render type to consider is exploded renders, which I know are pretty popular at competitions. And those are simply just done by moving the components. I know within Keyshot you can move the components natively, and it works pretty well. And also you can create animations with this to create cool little graphics. I know the Infinitude Facebook page had a 360 orbit of an exploded car, I believe, didn't it?
Yeah, it does. Thanks to James for that.
Yeah. So it's sort of these are the things. I'm sure you can do it similarly in Keyshot. Like you can create a lot of different scenes around your car. So that one, for example, was created by having a circle. You just create a circle shape. It's but like a sketch in CAD in Cinema 4D, and you lift that up, put that on a corner, and then you can set tags on all your objects. So for example, this was the camera. So the camera has a tag that says like attach or align to a spline. So the spline being the circle. So then you can set that, basically makes the circle the path of the camera, and then you can add a tag for a target on the camera, and so you can add that as a point on the car. So like in the center of the car. So you can set over time, you can set free keyframes, so the camera's moving around your car, and it's always targeting the center or something like that. And then you can add in keyframes and animations for your wheels and stuff moving out from the car and doing everything. And if you just work out the timings of it, depending on your frame rate and stuff. So if you leave the last frame as one frame before the exact same frame as the start, if that makes sense, you can make it so that it effectively loops perfectly every time.
And that just brings up some stuff to touch on, is that just know your rendering package. You know, a lot of these things you can do aren't overly complex. You just need to put components together. Like James said, it's just a tag that aligns the camera to a spline. And so you've got all of these different tags in Cinema, and I believe Blender does it a similar way, that you apply to cameras or to objects, like arrays and that kind of thing, and it can duplicate objects. And you've got your stage in Cinema 4D, which helps you switch between cameras mid-animation and all that kind of stuff. So know all of these kind of things of your rendering package, and it'll make, if you're doing animations, your life a lot easier.
Is the terminology you're talking about, like the spline and etc., is that all common across major sort of rendering packages, or are they all different?
They'll have slight differences, but they'll be generally quite similar. Like a spline may be called something else in Blender, I'm not sure, but there's a good bet it'll be called a path or something like that. Splines are just 2D drawings in 3D space, like a circle. It's just a 2D circle, right? And so splines generally are just lines. They don't have physical depth to them until you modify them, is what I'm talking about here.
Splines are a pretty common word, I know, in CATIA when you're doing GSD, generative shape design. So you have a 2D object in a 3D space.
Splines are effectively mathematical terminology, so they should be pretty constant over most different programs and most different uses, so it shouldn't be too much of an issue.
And so they're considered paths in Illustrator. So if you use Illustrator and you use paths, splines are very much the same as paths.
Okay.
And so that's probably the easiest way I can explain it.
Yeah, that clears it up for me as a non-rendering person. So the regulations. So they say that you can generate a render and isometric projection, rather, oblique projection, and perspective. Is someone able to explain what differences are between those three things?
So that's what I was talking about earlier with the perspective and parallel and the orthogonals. So the isometric projection is what you'll see on the orthographic drawings, and so you can render in that perspective. James, do you know what they're talking about with oblique?
I'm not 100% sure with oblique. I think it could just have to do with sort of the what do you call it, the focal length of the lens, possibly.
According to a quick Google search, an oblique projection is a parallel projection in which the lines of sight are not perpendicular to the projection plane.
Yeah, so it's sort of just it looks like more of a heads down kind of isometric.
Yeah.
Sort of look.
Okay. And how about perspective?
Yeah. Oh, perspective is what Michael mentioned before. So that's just really anything else. Essentially, it gives you this sense of perspective like the human eyes. So a straight line will disappear eventually. Sort of. Well, it's not like 90 degrees on corners and stuff like that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I'll provide a different, like the three different types of views. There'll be a link in the description to an image that explains it. Basically, if you take like a house, for the viewers who can't look at the image, if you take a house, perspective is what it's going to look like if you were standing looking at one of the corners of the house. Okay, that's what you would see as a human. Isometric is all proportioned equally. So if it's a square house, from the corner, if you're standing on the corner looking at it, the right-hand side corner and the left-hand side corner directly opposite in the house would be equal distance and would look equal distance away. So everything looks an equal distance away from the camera. There's no depth to them. There's no fall off due to length and that kind of thing. There's no perspective to it. The oblique projection would look like one side of the house is just flat to you, and then it's got the house sticking out of it. It's the best I can explain.
Yeah, so you can kind of get the idea as well if you use a camera lens. So if you think about focal length of a lens, so like when you zoom, you're changing the focal length relative to the sensor size of your camera, and that's effectively like the smaller focal length you have, it's going to look more more in a perspective view. But if you're in Cinema 4D or any other program, for example, and you increase the focal length of your like virtual camera, that's going to zoom it in more from further away. So the further away you are and the more it zoomed, it's going to look more like it's going to be parallel. So you can sort of get that idea. If you've ever used a camera lens and you zoom in from further away, you can sort of see how everything becomes a bit more square, as opposed if you came up close to it and it's a bit more rounded.
Yeah, you're compressing your background and you're exploding your foreground is what you're doing with a telephoto. Kind of.
I guess it's pretty hard to explain, but if you do a quick Google search, you can see easily pretty quick graphical.
And I've put a graphic in the show notes as well.
Awesome. Something else I was wondering is how far from the competition would you do a car render? Would you do it in the weeks before, in the months before? Would you wait for the final car to be produced, or would you do a car render before it's even been milled?
I guess for us, it sort of depends what your team's doing. I mean, like for us, we had just a date where our final car, we were just developing the car every day, and there was a certain date when that was finished. So from that point on, and even a bit before that, you're sort of thinking about what the livery is going to look like, and rendering programs are really good to sort of go that next step in conceptualizing how your livery is going to be by putting it onto the 3D surfaces after like drawing it or anything else. But I mean,
so would
really
you have based your livery on what you did in a render?
So pretty much when we started off, like when we started thinking about what we were going to do for our render, we made some quick orthographic drawings from all the projections, side projections in CATIA, and we just gave that to people of the team. We printed that off, and we got people to draw on it and do just a drawing of what they thought would look cool as a livery. And then we just got lots of different ideas from everyone on the team. And Luke and I sort of sat down one night and we just went through it. And he was on the Discord with me, and I was on Cinema 4D, and we were just sort of putting them onto 3D and then having a look around how they looked, which is sort of how we ended up with the one we've got now, just throwing ideas back and forth. But yeah, it's good to sort of just start off with a drawing and just work from there to get as many ideas as you can, because not everything looks as good in 3D as it does in 2D. With liveries.
And I mean, that's one way to do it. With Precision Racing, and it was a little bit the same with Infinitude. I used to just make multiple designs on the car on my own. I'd present them to the team and say, which ones do you like? What aspects do you like? And then I'd go away. I'd come back with some other designs based on those and the feedback they gave me. And so that worked well for Precision. We got a nice looking design that should have translated well onto the physical car. As per timeline, basically when the car was finalized in CAD is when I started rendering.
100%.
We didn't have a hard stop on the machining of the car. That was a more flexible deadline for us in Precision. But as soon as the car was finished in CAD and was starting to get the code written for it, I would start rendering the car out because it would just take quite a while to do. As for the design, of the Infinitude one, I have a bunch of prototypes that I came up with, and then we all had a big discussion about it, didn't we? Jesse and Peter, about what we wanted.
Yeah, and I think if I was to add anything, it's also that there's a lot of people. Even I think we asked some people that weren't part of the team, just some random people, what your thoughts were on the design. Because in the end, you might like the design, but you're not caring what really your team likes. It's how other people receive your brand, and that's one of the most important things of your car livery.
Yeah.
And so I think it should, in the most cases, strongly identify your team colors is an important part, and show your sponsors prominently. So if you look at Horizon, you've got an orange canister housing and a big Singapore Airlines logo on there, as well as the F1 in schools required stickers and that kind of thing. So that really shows off Singapore Airlines as your sponsor, and it really clearly identifies the car as your own with the big orange canister housing. And I believe you had the front wing as well.
Yeah, we had the sort of floor and teleguide element, so just to add a bit of balance to the front of the car, I have it red as well.
And so the Infinitude one was similar, with a very purple rear portion of the car. I think it's the rear third, pretty much, of the car has.
It's effectively just a wedge of the car.
It was
sliced down.
If you look at the body, I literally had Jesse cut the car for me, so that we could get that cut, to get that nice clean
separation.
Yeah, separation between the colors, because it was really difficult to do in cinema. So
yeah, otherwise you might have to put like a decal or try and wrap it around the surface.
Exactly. And that clearly identifies Infinitude, because I don't think there's any sponsor logos on the purple at all. It's just the purple and Infinitude. So all the white surfaces have the sponsors, but the purple surfaces really draw attention to the Infinitude brand. And so that was something that was really conscious in my mind, is making sure that Infinitude's branding stood out on the car as well as the sponsors.
Back to the timeline. What we mentioned before. For Horizon, it was sort of like once you got everything together, you had the main components of the livery. Like you really don't need to, as long as you've got all that made, there's no sort of, it doesn't have to be rendered until like the posters are required. So for us, there was a lot of changes in sort of sponsors, because when you get to that right at the end of it, towards the competition, was when we had the sort of biggest influx of sponsors, and when people started to become really interested in it. So you sort of just get everything ready to go, and then when we emailed off sponsors, for example, just double checking with them if they were okay with the logo placement, if they wanted anything different. For example, Singapore Airlines wanted us to change the side of the canister housing that they were on, because one of the things behind their logo is the bird of the Singapore Airlines logo. It's meant to face forwards. So just small details like that, making sure the sponsors are happy. But we didn't really need to finalize it until all the posters were required and stuff like that. And pretty much once the first thing had to be printed, which I think was the booth poster, then we sort of just decided that was going to be the final look for the car. because at that stage in manufacturing the cars, even though everything was up to probably like doing undercoats and stuff like that, we didn't have to finalize on the physical cars yet.
In terms of Ascension and how we've operated, we've actually got two people who mainly render our card. It'd be me and Feather Webster, our engineer. And together we sort of came together and came up with our livery and presented it to the team with a couple of different ideas. And once we were all happy with that, essentially as soon as I had the final car and the step file, I started rendering as soon as I could. And as soon as I could apply sponsorship decals, that's when final rendering stopped, essentially.
Mhm.
Okay. Do you have any more questions for us, Peter?
No, I think that's covered it pretty well. Thank you for explaining that for the benefit of me and anyone else out there who doesn't understand rendering.
And if this has raised any more questions for any of you, we do have socials, and so we may respond directly if we feel like it's something that wouldn't fit in an episode, or we may include it into a future episode if you have questions about anything, really, not just rendering, because we have many facets of F1 in schools here on the Track Podcast Incorporated.
I think the only thing we don't have is a team manager. Well, no, James, were you the team manager?
Yeah. So we have all facets covered, and we intend on getting guest hosts as well. So we'll certainly pick their brains for those kind of things. But for now, thanks for listening to Off the Track. You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, you can rate the show on Apple Podcasts, give us a 5-star review. It will really help spread the word about it. And make sure you follow us on Instagram as well, at Off the Track Podcast. And visit us at offthetrack.net. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys later.
Can I just add, stick around. The next episode is going to be an absolute mega one. We're going to be live in Abu Dhabi.
Oh, no.
And we're going to be with our special correspondent.
Is that going to be the next episode?
It would be.
Oh, no. It would be. Oh, no.
So stick around for that. It's going to be absolutely amazing.
It's going to be great.
Peter, are you even going to be here? You said you needed your beauty sleep.
No, that's for the awards dinner. I'm going to be around for the podcast recording. I'll be around for that.
Sure.
But there may be a Off the Track live stream if we can get enough people as well at the awards dinner.
That would be exciting.
Yes.
Last year's live stream was pretty fun. I wasn't live streaming.
No. Yes, stick around. Keep your ears out. Follow our socials, and we'll see what happens. Okay.
If you have any topics you want us to cover, let us know via our social media, and we'll try to cover it.
Yeah, because we're running out of ideas here, guys.
We really are.
Our discussion topics is only in Thai channel.
Yeah, but all right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you all later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.